Hello everyone, I know it's been 3 years and I am making another video on the Imperial Knights. And you might wonder why I'm making another video. Well, the first monograph in English on the subject was released 2 years ago, and it contains a lot more information that could be gleaned from more general books on the Empire or from Wikipedia and such. And so I would like to make this second video. So let's recap. What were the Imperial Knights? In short, they were a group of about 400 families across 1,600 or so small estates, covering about 10,000 square kilometers. And these were scattered throughout the Rhenish, Franconian, and Swabian regions of the empire, and they owed direct allegiance to the emperor, much as the princes did. And this was instead of being owing any kind of allegiance to intermediate lords, counts, or princes. And despite their meager holdings, through clever politicking, asymmetrical warfare, collective action, imperial favor, and sheer tenacity, they were able to maintain some semblance of independence from their emergence in the High Middle Ages, through the rise of centralized territorial principalities in the 1400s, through the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, all the way to the end of the empire. So, let's start by talking about their origins. So the origins of the knights are somewhat shrouded in mystery. As with many nobles, they were fond of devising fanciful legends as to their origins. Many of them would trace themselves to the time of Charlemagne. Allegedly, they had been granted their free and autonomous status by Charlemagne as a reward for their services. The truth, however, is probably a lot more prosaic. In the 13th century, with the fall of the Hohenstaufen, the imperial crown lands, which had belonged to the imperial crown as such, rather than to the hereditary holdings of whichever dynasty had found itself elected, declined in importance. Elected emperors increasingly relied on their family lands, such as Austria for the Habsburgs or Bohemia for the House of Luxembourg, to carry out the various functions of their office. These old imperial crown lands were overwhelmingly concentrated in what had been the Hohenstaufen heartlands of Franconia, Swabia, and the Upper Rhineland. And these regions were now heavily fragmented, and there were no princes who could really dominate the region in the way that, for example, the Habsburgs could dominate Austria, or the Wittelsbachs could dominate Bavaria via the duchy. And so there were many points of fissure in which petty lords could carve out a small niche for themselves. Now, there was a group of people in the empire, two in fact, called the free nobles, and another group called the ministerials, who lived in these regions and would form the core of what would later become the Imperial Knights. The ministerials were essentially unfree serfs, legally speaking, who nonetheless provided administrative and military service to their lords and to the emperor. And as Emperor Charles IV, King of Bohemia, came to power in the later 14th century, many of the villages, castles, and estates held by ministerials and free nobles on behalf of the emperor were alienated or sold to the people holding these particular offices. And between these small alienated estates and between the fissures and liminal spaces created by the ambiguous, incomplete, and overlapping jurisdictions of the imperial princes and lords, the Imperial Knights start to form and solidify into an identifiable body in the 15th century, although at the time they would be called the Free Knights, often referring to themselves as Free Franks if they lived in Franconia, or Free Swabians if they lived in Swabia. In the early 15th century, Emperor Sigismund gave them the right to organize, hoping to gain some leverage against the princes, especially since his control over his family lands in Bohemia were so tenuous due to the Hussite rebellion. By recognizing and encouraging these leagues and protecting them from princely encroachment, he hoped to secure a stronger foothold in the empire. But the Knights would only begin to take shape properly in the late 15th century with the start of the Imperial Reform movement. In order to best understand the knights, we need to draw a distinction between two types of holdings in the medieval and early modern periods: fiefs and allods. Now, I want to make a caveat first. These terms could be used interchangeably at the time, and the distinction is more of an idealization than a concrete reality. Nonetheless, we can safely define an allod, A-L-L-O-D, as land that was held freely, independent of any superior and without any obligations, except perhaps, in theory, to the emperor himself. And a fief as land or rights of some kind, say to extract tolls if it didn't take the form of land, conditioned on some kind of concrete service to a lord or a prince, and which could not be freely disposed of. The services owed were typically military, but could also be advisory or administrative. Besides their allodial estates, the lands that they held freely, which as stated earlier, consisted of about 1,600 or so estates, averaging perhaps 3 square miles, 2 square miles, knights held numerous fiefs, typically from multiple princes, and they would juggle their obligations to their respective suzerains and leaders. This life was harder than one might expect, with long periods spent on campaigns, long days spent hunting criminals and malefactors, working as mercenaries, and all sorts of other things. At the center of their estates, Imperial Knights would typically have at least one, usually relatively small castle, like Castle Ebbenburg, though some held fairly substantial seats as well, such as Eltz. Other castles include Hornburg, which is probably an inspiration for Helm's Deep. That was held by the famous Imperial Knight Götz von Berlichingen. Now, by holding multiple fiefs, in addition to their allodial holdings, they enhanced their power, but crucially, they also gained leverage over the princes who might try to annex them, and they could use their ties to multiple princes to play them off against each other. Indeed, sometimes knights would even pledge some of their allodial holdings to a prince as fiefs in return for protection in their personal conflicts with each other and other princes, which led to quite a tangle of ambiguous overlapping jurisdictions. Now, the knights had quite a rivalry with the princes, and to understand it, we need to know about something called territorialization. Territorialization refers to how, over the centuries, the dukes and princes of the empire converted their holdings from loose bundles of scattered rights over a wide area into increasingly well-defined, very exclusive territorial entities which did not overlap with those of their neighbors. And this process begins to approach completion in the late 15th century and drastically accelerates with the Reformation, which will be discussed a bit later. This was also accompanied by a transition from Germanic common law to Roman law, which vested more power in the princes and eroded customary law in favor of princely authority, statutes, and legislation. Now, between the fissures which thus emerged from this process of territorialization and taking into consideration legal ambiguities and multi-vassalage, the princes continually tried to encroach upon the rights of the Imperial Knights. One difficulty was that knights, while having jurisdiction over their own lands, had no rights of high justice, such as the right to execute criminals, and so local princes or the distant emperor, in this period not really able to properly adjudicate disputes in much of the empire, had to be appealed to. And this undermined whatever independence they technically were supposed to have. And another big issue is that whether an estate was actually a fief or an allod was often disputed, an ambiguity which was, of course, compounded by the tendency to pledge allodial estates as fiefs. Now, since the princes were much more powerful than the knights, they faced little hope of victory in direct open warfare, and so they resorted to the feud, which the author Richard J. Ninus calls a type of limited asymmetrical warfare at which the knights excelled. A prince's subjects might cause harm, for example, to a knight's estate, say by allowing his sheep to graze on the pastures of one of a knight's tenants. And since they didn't trust the land-hungry princes to rule in the favor of justice or the victim themselves, a knight would declare a feud. A knight would launch raids into a prince's territory, kidnapping civilians, holding them for ransom, burning villages and farmland, and so on. Knights could not defeat princes in a pitched battle, or at least they could only do so very rarely. But they could make a prince's life a living hell. This was tolerated until the Imperial Reform movement beginning in 1495, and it was seen as part of the unwritten constitution, so to speak, of the empire. Of course, feuds could go on very, very far and become very, very extreme, and a knight could lose everything. But many were willing to put everything on the line to protect their honor, their independence, and that of their class in general. And what's often remarkable is that through sheer persistence, they often came out on top. They might regain their castles in the long run, sneaking up on a garrison and taking it under the dark of the night. And this was often after having become outlaws. Now, knights would cling to feuding for quite some time, well past the perpetual peace had been declared in 1495 at the Diet of Worms, until they became satisfied with the form of the Constitution, and until the coercive power of the state, of course, became sufficient to stamp out their feuding for good in the mid-late 1500s. Now, of course, we ought not idealize these feuds. Between feuding and utter wars by the princes, vast swaths of the countryside could be devastated, and hundreds of small villages completely destroyed. And the knights might declare a feud against a prince or a city on the flimsiest of pretexts. But violence is ultimately the font of authority, and the knights were not ready to surrender one of the most important sources of leverage they had in the form of the feud, especially when they could not yet trust the courts to deliver fair verdicts, and while they yet lacked any representation in the Reichstag, the imperial diet. Now, there is something called the Knights' Revolt, which is one of the last major feuds, and it's sort of illustrative. An important feud, the Knights' Revolt, which lasted from 1522 to 1523, was led by the knight Franz von Sickingen and the other knight Ulrich von Hutten. Sickingen was a very successful mercenary captain among the Rhenish knights, as well as an early patron of the Reformation, who made a living terrorizing the inhabitants of the region through extortions and ransoms. Leveraging Reformation sentiment and the grievances of many Rhenish and even some Franconian knights, Sickingen and Hutten amassed an army of about 5,000 men to besiege the city of Trier, which was the capital of the Prince Archbishopric of Trier. Unfortunately for him, he was soundly defeated by three princes, the Landgrave of Hessen, the Elector Palatine, and the Archbishop of Trier himself, and he retreated to his castle, ultimately dying of his wounds. And this is often seen as one of the last hurrahs of the Imperial Knights. If you want to learn more, look up the Knights' Revolt. Now, the Imperial Reform movement begins in 1495 at the Diet of Worms under Emperor Maximilian I, and he sought to reform the empire into something more formalized with representation for the various estates, and ideally something more centralized. Now, feuding and private warfare were, at least on paper, banned at this diet, but as stated earlier, the knights were not granted representation, unlike the cities or the princes or the counts and barons. Additionally, the common penny, the gemeine Pfennig, would prove to be a failure, in part due to the knights' unwillingness to pay it. This was supposed to be a tax that would be levied on all subjects of the empire, and originally these taxes were supposed to be collected either by the imperial church or by the princes, and the knights were very reluctant to yield any authority over taxation, even a delegated authority, to these entities, because they saw it as relinquishing some of their sovereignty. Moreover, traditionally, the nobility had been tax exempt, and the knights stubbornly refused to pay the tax, citing that they already owed a blood tax in the form of military service, something they would also seek to dodge. Moreover, they distrusted the proposed mechanisms by which the tax would be collected, as I stated before. While the princes paid lip service and were eager to frame the knights as disloyal for refusing to pay, they ultimately did what they could do to dodge the tax as well, and it would be some time before the tax could be properly collected. Ultimately, it would be through the knights' own system of cantons and circles that they would pay taxes, collecting them from one another, but this came later. During the Peasants' War of 1524 to 1526, many knights, such as Florian Geyer, would attempt to ride the tidal wave of popular discontent to lead the peasants in revolt against the princes and the emperor. A major dream of the knights was to eliminate the princes altogether and gain imperial immediacy for all of the nobility of the empire under the emperor. So when I say all of the nobility, I am including the so-called territorial nobility, who held fiefs from the princes and did not have any of their own allodial holdings, which were, legally speaking, free of any obligation to the princes. However, the peasants scarcely trusted the knights more than the princes, and ultimately, those few knights who did join the Peasants' War would be crushed, regardless of their support. Ultimately, the knights knew that they could not remain as free sovereign citizens forever, and that they would need to seek imperial patronage if they were to preserve their freedom. This took some time, and it was not formalized till the latter half of the 16th century. Eventually, an arrangement was reached where they would pay taxes and provide military service to the emperor directly, something which began to take shape under Charles V, but only really solidified under his younger brother and successor, Emperor Ferdinand I, who was more involved with the empire and better able to tend to their concerns. Now, they refused to take part of a system called the Imperial Circles, which divided the empire into multiple regions, which organized taxation and common defense, because they felt that these circles were too dominated by their rivals, the princes. And so the knights would ultimately create their own Franconian, Swabian, and Rhenish circles with 6, 5, and 3 sub-cantons, respectively. They would pay their taxes directly into a common treasury, which was then to be handed to the emperor. Originally a court of appeals, you also had the Imperial Chamber Court, and this would become the court of first resort for the Imperial Knights, since, as I've stated before, local courts were dominated by the princes, and the knights needed to work together and with the emperor to assure that the princes would not simply always rule in their own favor. And working together, they would compile their grievances on a regular basis against the princes, and they would submit them to the Imperial Chamber Court to protect their interests together. Now, this would often take years. The Imperial Chamber Court was a very, very slow institution. Some lawsuits took as long as a century, although that's very much an outlier. And besides that, the knightly circles would discipline their own members who broke their common code of honor and went around looking for trouble, although it took some time for them to begin doing so systematically, as they were always inclined to defend their own, especially since the princes were always inclined to defend themselves and defend their own in their conflicts with the knights. Now, through imperial patronage, the emperor gained leverage over the princes and the knights' protection against their predation. Using protection of the knights as a pretext, as well as his ability to mediate between the princes and the knights, the emperor could easily keep many of the princes in southern, western, and central Germany in check, pitting the low and the high, namely himself, against the middle, the princes. This mirrors how integration of the lower nobility in Western Europe as direct subjects played an important role in centralizing royal power outside the empire, in places like France, where it succeeded to a far greater degree, and where princes and great magnates would ultimately be rendered impotent. Moreover, the privilege of non-appeal had been granted to more and more princes over the centuries, meaning the territorial nobility of the principalities could not easily be pitted against the princes. And the knights only controlled 1 or 2% of the empire's territory. And this caused some problems. It meant that a centralized monarchy couldn't really be established. The princes had grown too powerful, the magnates as well. And so, unlike in France, the establishment of a flatter noble hierarchy under the king was not something that was fully accomplished. Now, some knights would seek to change this in the latter half of the 16th century again, and it was a long-standing dream of the knights to somehow crush the princes and create a flat noble hierarchy under the direct authority of the emperor. Now, before I continue, I have to talk a bit about the Reformation and the Imperial Church, and how the princes responded to it. Now, as I've explained, the empire was a mess of overlapping jurisdictions, and part of the process of territorialization, which I mentioned earlier, consisted of resolving these sorts of conflicts and ambiguities in favor of territorial princes. One such gray zone was the imperial church. A prince, before the Reformation, would have certain rights over churches in and around his territory on various bases, and the Reformation gave the perfect pretext to force the issue and resolve the ambiguity in their favor. One basis of the jus reformandi, or the so-called right of reformation, was an older right called the jus patronatus, the right of patronage. This was the so-called right of people who greatly endowed or founded the construction of a particular church or parish to nominate or appoint its pastors. The more absolute the right, the more a prince could claim the right to appoint only Protestant pastors when the Reformation came around. Now, the Augsburg Settlement of 1555 determined that princes possessed the right of reformation, allowing them to reform their local churches, and it confirmed them in the churches they had already seized, whether in or around their territory. Imperial Knights were also granted freedom of conscience to choose their own religion. However, there was a dubium, which revolved around whether they too had the right of reformation. In order to push the Reformation in their own territories, Lutheran Knights pushed the right of patronage to its limits, since they lacked an explicit right of reformation. This would eventually cause tension between themselves and the prince-bishops, which I will discuss later. Now, a further note to make about the Augsburg settlement is the opportunity missed by the knights due to their own cowardice and indecision. During the Schmalkaldic War of 1546 to 1547, which I might discuss in a future video, numerous Protestant princes took up arms against the emperor in a preemptive strike. We will leave a more comprehensive discussion thereof to another day. The knights were generally quite sympathetic to the emperor, even though most were Protestant. But due to fear of princely retaliation, they had been reluctant to fight alongside the emperor in this war, and few joined him, either during this conflict, which the emperor won, or the subsequent conflicts which saw the emperor narrowly avoid defeat and capture, which served to undermine Charles V's grand plan to reorganize the knights and princes into a great league in which both parties would have say, and through which the Habsburgs would run the empire in a more centralized manner. The Augsburg settlement ended up being far more conciliatory to the princes because of the indecision of the knights and their unwillingness to support the emperor. Now, one of the final gasps of knightly feuding and their goal of establishing a flatter noble hierarchy for all the nobles in the empire is seen in the tragedy of Wilhelm von Grumbach. Wilhelm von Grumbach was a Franconian imperial knight with a lot of power and influence and ties to the Ernestine Weddens and also to the Hohenzollerns in Franconia. Now, the Prince Bishop of Würzburg seized some of his estates, which led him to make alliances with the Ernestine Wedden Duke of Saxony and the Hohenzollern Margrave of Bayreuth. And surprisingly, he succeeded in seizing the city of Würzburg in 1563 with an army, sacking it in the process. And he tried to rally support around himself, making up a lot of ecstatic religious visions and whipping up religious discontent in order to call all the nobles of the empire to revolt against the princes and create this flatter noble hierarchy. But unfortunately for him, a league of princes and even some knights turned against him, and all his estates were seized and he was executed. Grumbach represents the last gasp of the feud and their resort to extra-legal measures in the empire. Now, one of the critical provisions of the Peace of Augsburg was something called the Ecclesiastical reservation, which stipulated that if a prince-bishop became Protestant, he would have to resign and make way for a Catholic candidate. Strangely to us, this infuriated the Protestant princes, who saw the prince-bishoprics as places to stuff their younger sons and expand their influence. The ecclesiastical reservation was critical in defending the prince-bishoprics from being converted into further secular Protestant principalities, similar to how the Teutonic Order had been turned into the Lutheran Duchy of Prussia in 1525 by a Hohenzollern Grand Master, who subsequently appointed himself Duke of Prussia, with Polish connivance and cooperation because they wanted to gain control of the area. Though largely Protestant, the knights would use this to their advantage. The The knights traditionally controlled the 7 prince bishoprics along the Middle Rhine and the main rivers, and would strengthen this control, monopolizing the title of bishop for the remainder of the empire's history. These bishoprics were Trier, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Eichstätt, Würzburg, and Bamberg, the so-called Priest's Alley, located in the Rhenish and Franconian circles. They controlled the cathedral chapters, which were responsible for electing prince bishoprics, and they monopolized the position of canon within those chapters, electing their own as bishops. This involved younger sons making rather perfunctory vows and conversions to Catholicism, if they were not already Catholic, and being educated as clerics. And the bishop would act as a sort of president of an aristocratic republic, which would defend the interests of the knights in the region and would work for them. And this greatly expanded their power and leverage against the princes. And this was tolerated for some time. Now, these bishoprics were not the most observant of places. Most canons and many bishops had concubines, and the clerics lived very luxuriously, although that's not in and of itself un-Catholic. Often the actual spiritual duties of the episcopal offices would be delegated to auxiliary canons and bishops who did the actual work of saying Mass and caring for souls. Now, this began to change at the tail end of the 16th century. Well after Trent, Reform-minded bishops began to take charge and took to the task of introducing Jesuits, the Counter-Reformation, and Trent. This created fissures in the traditionally symbiotic relationship between the Protestant knights and the Catholic knights and clergy. A major point of contention was the so-called jus reformandi of the knights, their right of reformation. These new bishops called this into question, and they forcibly reconverted many churches in knightly territory, their fiefs and their allodia, to Catholicism, which had often been forcibly made Protestant, make no mistake. This was made worse by the prince bishoprics joining the Catholic League in the early 1600s, headed by the shrewd Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria. This created deep fissures in the knightly community, which would culminate with most of the Protestant knights, at least initially, siding with the Swedes in the 30 Years' War, an action they would come to regret. The 30 Years' War is far too complicated to get into deeply here, but to suffice it to say, the Swedes quickly overstayed their welcome in the empire, and alongside the Duchy of Franconia, which they had created and given to the Duke of Saxe-Weimar, they had kind of reorganized the prince-bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg into a new Duchy of Franconia, and the knights would owe them direct allegiance. They proved far more invasive and meddlesome than either the emperor or reformist bishops in the imperial church had been, demanding a lot more of them. And ultimately, the various German knights and princes would make peace with the emperor in the 1635 Peace of Prague, whose terms were further refined in the 1648 Peace of Westphalia. The jus reformandi of the knights was confirmed in a fashion. 1624 was made the normative year for the empire, and every state would be permanently locked in to whatever religion it had been in the year 1624. Princes and knights could continue to choose their religion privately, but the religion of their states would be permanently fixed, although the Habsburgs retained the right to continue converting their own lands back to Catholicism. And so, let's end this with a short discussion. Aristotle called a constitution the concrete actuality of a state. And now, I'm not an expert on Aristotle. I'm not sure exactly how I should interpret that. But I like to think that a constitution has less to do with what's written down on a piece of paper and more to do with the actual balance of power between various institutions within a state. There being some kind of a stable balance of power within a state. And any disruption or threat to that balance of power will usually be met by some kind of large-scale rebellion or riot or discontent. And rulers and subjects need to tiptoe around these often unwritten rules and unwritten balance to avoid upsetting things. And as such, any kind of written constitution needs to be backed up to some extent. This is something the founding fathers of the United States would agree with, by a willingness to commit to a certain amount of violence. And this was something that the Imperial Knights really excelled at. And this brings me to the title of this video. I called this video Sovereign Citizens of the Reich, but I'm kind of doing a disservice to the Imperial Knights by comparing them to the sovereign citizen movement in the United States. Because where the sovereign citizen movement in the United States thinks that they can use pieces of paper and legal arguments against the state, the Imperial Knights were able to back up their pretensions to independence and a limited kind of sovereignty through asymmetrical warfare, through organizing with one another, through the taking over of local jurisdictions. And ultimately, it's very, very impressive that they lasted as long as they did. Ultimately, their states would be taken over in German mediatization, where in the early 1800s, the various medium-sized states, responding to the chaos of Napoleon's invasion of Germany, were able to take over all of the small states, which included many of the counties, many of the baronies, and the knightly states as well. And these states would retain a certain amount of their prestige and rights from before mediatization, but they would never really regain it. The empire, as I've explained before, would end because the emperor could no longer mediate between these small states and these medium-sized states. And so I leave you with this. I hope that was a good video. I'm sorry for rambling in places. I will talk to you again soon.